His body was found in a ravine, barely 50 meters from a well-trodden tourist trail. His neck was broken. His eyes had been covered with his own t-shirt, tied so tightly it cut into the skin. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruises, no torn branches, no evidence of panic. Someone had come up from behind and ended his life in one quiet, deliberate motion. It should have been a brutal, chaotic scene, yet everything felt disturbingly calm, as though it had been arranged. The discovery left investigators baffled and the public unsettled. Who had done this, and why in such a way? A death so silent, so precise, suggested intention, perhaps even ritual. Within moments, viewers are pulled into a world where nothing adds up. A murder with no fight, a blindfold with no purpose, and a victim who never saw it coming. This is not just a crime story. It's a puzzle one that begins with the ending. As the forest keeps its secrets, we are left with a single, haunting question. What really happened out there among the trees? Before that day, Mark Henderson lived the sort of life most people might envy for its calm predictability. He was the kind of man who found comfort in quiet routines. The morning cup of coffee brewed to the same strength each day. The evening news humming softly in the background. The weekend hikes that offered him both solitude and peace. To his colleagues, he was reliable to a fault, never late, never flustered, the kind of person who held things together when everyone else lost their footing. At home, Sarah would often joke that Mark had been born 50 years too late, that he would have been perfectly suited to a time when letters were handwritten and plans were made on paper maps rather than screens. He wasn't old-fashioned, just deliberate. He liked things he could touch, things that stayed where he left them. It was this quality, that quiet steadiness, that made her feel safe. When he said he'd be back by Sunday evening, she never doubted it. Mark's passion for hiking wasn't about adrenaline or the pursuit of conquest, it was about clarity. The forest, for him, was a sanctuary, not an escape from life, but a way of remembering what mattered. He knew every sound of the Olympic woods. The drip of rain through cedar needles, the distant call of jays, the rhythm of his own footsteps on wet soil. Nature made sense in a way people sometimes didn't. That weekend in September had been planned with his usual precision. The night before he left, he laid everything out on the kitchen table: the compass, the weatherproof matches, the GPS tracker, the rolled sleeping bag, the thermos Sarah had given him years ago. He checked the batteries twice, cross-referenced his route with recent trail reports, and texted Sarah his planned coordinates. "I'll message once I'm settled by the creek," he said, smiling the way he always did before heading off, part excitement, part reassurance. Sarah had long since grown used to these trips. At first, she'd worried the wilderness, the unpredictable weather, but over time, she'd come to trust his meticulous habits. He was cautious, more scout than adventurer. His friends teased him for his emergency kits and laminated maps, but that was Mark. Prepared, grounded, methodical. It was hard to imagine anything bad could happen to someone so careful. He left early the next morning, just as the first light spread across the sky. The last thing Sarah saw was his small wave from the car window, the quiet, habitual farewell of a man who'd done this a dozen times before. There was nothing dramatic about it. Just another weekend, another walk in the woods. The drive to Olympic National Park took 3 hours. Along the way, Mark listened to an old radio station playing soft folk songs. He stopped once for petrol and a sandwich, and at 10:42 a.m., he entered the park gates. CCTV later confirmed that was the last time he was seen alive. But in that moment, nothing seemed wrong, the world still ordinary, still safe. By early afternoon, he had set up camp by Lucino Creek. The GPS pinged his location exactly as planned. Sarah received his message. "Got here, all good, beautiful day, love you." She smiled, replied with a heart, and went on with her day. For her, that was enough. He was fine, he always was. And yet, looking back, there's something haunting about that final message. The simplicity of it, the innocence. Every detail. His careful packing, his route planning, his quiet confidence builds a portrait of a man in complete control of his world. But in true crime, that's where the dread begins. When you meet the person who shouldn't, by all logic, become a victim. This was Mark's ordinary world, calm, structured, unthreatening. The life of a man who trusted the forest because he respected it, who believed that safety could be earned through preparation. But as we soon learn, the woods don't care how careful you are. And that calm, that sense of security, is what makes the next moment the silence that follows all the more unbearable. For now, though, we leave him there standing by the creek, adjusting his tent ropes, unaware that this peaceful afternoon will be the last normal day of his life. At first, it was nothing unusual, just a small delay, a silence Sarah barely noticed. Mark always checked in before nightfall, a quick text, a short call if there was a signal. When her phone stayed quiet that evening, she told herself it was fine. Reception in the forest could vanish without warning. He'd call in the morning. But when morning came and still nothing, an unease began to settle in her chest, the kind that doesn't fade with logic. By midday, she opened the GPS tracking app he'd shared with her, a simple safety habit they'd developed over years of hiking. The screen loaded slowly, a blinking blue dot pulsing against the green of the digital map. Then it froze. His location hadn't changed in more than 12 hours. The coordinates sat still, fixed by the Lucino Creek. She refreshed, waited, refreshed again. The dot didn't move. The GPS dot froze, like his life stopped in that moment. That single line would later appear in news reports, but at the time, it was only a quiet dread growing inside Sarah's stomach. She called the ranger station, her voice trembling as she explained that her husband hadn't checked in. The ranger asked calm, procedural questions. When did you last hear from him? Was he alone? Does he have medical conditions? Questions meant to reassure, but they didn't. By afternoon, a search team was assembled. The forest was heavy with fog that day, the kind of mist that hangs low, muffling sound, turning every shape into a ghost of itself. The search began along the trail nearest to the pinned GPS location, just 50 meters from where hikers often stopped for photos. It should have been easy to find him, but the woods had swallowed him whole. The first hours brought nothing. The team found his footprints near the stream, faint but visible in the damp soil. Then they stopped abruptly, as if he'd simply stepped out of existence. No sign of a struggle, no misplaced gear, not even a broken branch. Only stillness. As darkness fell, the searchers called his name into the fog. Their voices came back muted, hollow. Radios crackled with static, cutting through the rain. It was as if the forest itself was resisting their presence, absorbing sound instead of returning it. The fear didn't come from what they saw, but from what they didn't. For Sarah, waiting in the ranger's office, time stretched painfully slow. Each hour without news pressed against her chest like a weight. The rangers told her not to panic. "It happens," one said gently. "People wander off trail. We'll find him." But she knew Mark. He didn't wander. He was deliberate, cautious. The kind of man who checked his compass twice before turning left. Night too came, and with it, the rain. Helicopters couldn't fly low enough through the mist. Drones lost signal. Search dogs picked up faint traces that led nowhere. The coordinates on the GPS remained unchanged, as if frozen in time. The rescuers began marking grids on maps, dividing the forest into sections to comb through. Each search zone ended the same silence. In documentaries, this is where the dread begins to take form, not from screams or violence, but from absence. The forest became a character itself, indifferent and impenetrable. The dripping leaves, the hiss of rain, the faint crack of twigs under boots, all mundane sounds, but together they built an atmosphere of quiet suffocation. Sarah barely slept. She replayed the last message in her head. "Got here, all good. Beautiful day. Love you." The words felt cruel now, their normality unbearable. How could something so calm mark the start of something so wrong? She scrolled through his messages, searching for a hint, a clue, something that might explain why he'd stopped moving, but there was nothing. Just warmth, love, routine, and then a void. By the third day, media began to arrive. Cameras, microphones, and quiet. Speculation filled the space between trees. Missing posters were printed, and volunteers joined the search. Still, no trace. Every theory felt impossible. If he'd fallen, they'd have found the body. If he'd run, someone would have seen him. Somewhere deep in that vast expanse of moss and mist, a single truth waited. But for now, all anyone had was that motionless dot on a screen, the frozen symbol of a life that had simply stopped. And as the search widened, the story shifted from hope to dread. The forest had turned silent, and silence, in the world of true crime, is rarely innocent. They found him on the fourth day. It was early morning when one of the searchers, a volunteer named Daniel Price, noticed something through the mist. Just a flicker of color, half buried under the wet ferns, no more than 50 meters from the main tourist trail. For a moment, he thought it was a discarded jacket. Then he saw the shape beneath it. Mark Henderson's body lay on his side, one arm slightly bent, the other stretched out as if reaching for something. His eyes were covered by what turned out to be his own t-shirt, tied neatly around his head. His neck was broken cleanly, almost surgically, and yet the surrounding ground told no story of struggle. No torn earth, no drag marks, no desperate signs of resistance. It was as if his body had simply been placed there, gently, with care. The discovery silenced everyone. The forest, usually full of subtle noise birds, dripping branches, shifting wind, seemed to hold its breath. Even the radios crackled more softly. There was no sense of violence, only an unnatural stillness. Investigators marked the site with tape, moving slowly, deliberately, their boots sinking into the damp soil. Every detail felt wrong. His rucksack was zipped and intact, his equipment neatly arranged, and next to his tent untouched, half collapsed by rain, lay 2 sleeping bags. One was his, the other wasn't. That second sleeping bag became the story's quiet obsession. It was too new to have been his, and too dry to have been abandoned long ago. Someone had been there. Someone had shared that space, maybe for hours, maybe for a night before vanishing into the fog. The forensic team combed through the area for footprints, but the ground was too soft, too soaked. Rain had erased everything. The only things left behind were the cold logic of objects and the absence of explanation. Later, during the coroner's report, one phrase would echo through the hearing room. He didn't even realize what was happening. The nature of the break in his neck suggested suddenness, a swift, precise movement, fatal in an instant. There were no defensive wounds, no bruises on his arms, no signs he'd even seen it coming. That line haunted people. It transformed the scene from tragedy into quiet horror, the kind that crawls under the skin, because it suggested intimacy. To kill someone that quietly, that cleanly, you have to be close, close enough to touch, close enough to speak. In true crime, horror doesn't always come from the grotesque. Sometimes it's the absence of chaos that unsettles us most. Mark's death was like a riddle made of silence, no noise, no witnesses, no sense of struggle, just stillness and an eerie kind of order. Detectives reconstructed his last known movements, tracing the short walk between his camp and the ravine. It was barely a 5-minute stretch. People passed that area every day. Families, couples, dog walkers. The idea that he could vanish, die, and lie there unnoticed 50 meters from civilization defied all sense of reason. Sarah was taken to identify the body. The footage of her arrival was never released, but one ranger described the moment she saw him as the air leaving the room. She couldn't understand why his eyes had been covered. He hated tight things over his face, she said quietly. He wouldn't have done that himself. That detail, the blindfold, became the story's dark symbol. It stripped away the comfort of randomness. This wasn't an accident, nor an act of nature. Someone had been there. Someone had watched him die. And for reasons no one could explain, they had covered his eyes after. As the day faded, the forensic team carried his body out under the fading light. Rain began again, steady and cold. The trail emptied, and the forest returned to its indifferent rhythm. Back at the base, detectives stared at the evidence table. 2 sleeping bags, a GPS unit still. Functional, a folded map with a single route highlighted. Everything logical, everything in order, and yet nothing that made sense. There were no suspects, no footprints, no fingerprints. Just one unnerving truth. Someone had shared that campsite with Mark Henderson, and whoever it was, they had erased themselves perfectly. The police would call it a contained mystery, meaning everything needed to solve it was already there except the meaning. But to those who worked the case, it felt like something else entirely. Something had entered Mark's quiet, ordinary world, moved through it without force or noise, and left behind a tableau that looked almost peaceful, if not for the unbearable wrongness of it all. And that was the worst part. Not the violence, not the death, but the calm. The suggestion that whatever had happened out there in the fog wasn't rage or panic or impulse, but purpose. Because if he didn't even realize what was happening, maybe that was exactly how it was meant to be. The forensic lab results arrived 2 weeks later, a small envelope, a sterile sheet of paper, and a line of text that made the entire investigation unravel. The DNA recovered from the second sleeping bag didn't match anyone. Not in the national database, not in Interpol's system, not even in any record from the surrounding counties. It belonged to no one, a genetic ghost. Detectives stared at the report, waiting for someone to explain how that could be. There was no contamination, no lab error, no administrative fault. The profile was clear, but the person behind it simply did not exist. It was as though the forest had given birth to someone for a single night and then swallowed them whole again. That sleeping bag became the haunting centerpiece of the case. It was examined, retested, even traced to its manufacturer in Oregon. The shop records showed it had been sold cash, no name, no CCTV footage, just another untraceable object in a chain of silence. To the public, the story shifted from tragedy to obsession. Online forums filled with theories, a drifter, a hermit, a secret cult. But the more people tried to connect the dots, the more the pattern resisted logic. There were no signs of robbery, no motive, no message left behind. Only one man dead, and one uninvited presence whose DNA said someone was here and then erased itself from the world. Investigators began to question the meaning of what they were chasing. If a crime leaves no trace, does it still belong to the realm of human reason? Or does it slip into something else, something older, colder, less comprehensible? Sarah, Mark's wife, once said in an interview, "It feels like whoever did it wasn't trying to hide, they just don't exist in the way we do." Her words captured the essence of what everyone was feeling. The horror was no longer about what happened, but why it could happen at all. The symbolism of that second sleeping bag lingered like a shadow. It was proof of presence and absence. It meant someone had shared Mark's final night, close enough to hear his breathing, perhaps even his dreams. And then, by morning, that person was gone, leaving behind only the impression of warmth and death. For true crime audiences, this wasn't closure. It was the opposite, an open wound. The story resisted resolution, leaving only an echo of unease. That's what made it unforgettable, not the brutality, but the void where logic should have been. When the case file was eventually closed, one detective off the record described it as an equation that refused to balance. And perhaps that's what truly unnerved people. Because behind the spreadsheets, the evidence bags, and the clinical reports, there was a deeper truth that sometimes evil isn't chaotic or passionate. Sometimes it's quiet, careful, and completely indifferent to being understood. In the final narration of the documentary, the voice lowered almost to a whisper. He came as a friend, and left as an executioner. No one knew who he was, or even if that word fit. But it left a chill that stayed long after the credits rolled, a reflection not just on a crime, but on trust, on the limits of knowing, and on how easily light can be replaced by silence. Somewhere out there, someone knows the truth. Maybe it's a person who's lived with it for years, carrying the memory like a stone in their pocket, heavy but hidden. Or maybe the truth was swallowed by the forest itself, buried beneath the wet soil and roots that have long since erased every footprint. In the end, all that remains is the silence and the echo of a story that refuses to settle. What happened to Mark Henderson was more than a mystery. It was a mirror held up to the fragility of trust, how easily a moment of faith can turn into the last mistake we ever make. The second sleeping bag, the blindfold, the untraceable DNA, they linger not as evidence, but as symbols of how little we understand about the people who walk beside us. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. The idea that evil doesn't always arrive as a shadow in the night, but sometimes as a hand extended in friendship. If this story made you think twice about trust, about fear, about how fragile truth can be, then stay with us. There are more stories out there waiting to be told, more unanswered questions that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with those who crave the strange and the real, and join us next time where another quiet mystery waits in the dark.